Hello and welcome to episode 69 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh DeHaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
I'm Joanna Barron, Executive Director of the CCF.
And I'm Christine Van Geyn, the CCF's Litigation Director.
In today's episode, I'll tell you about some of the practical legal impacts of the Prime Minister's decision to prorogue Parliament.
And I'm going to wade into some of those divergent opinions about whether prorogation can be challenged in court.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to tell you about the final report of the Parliamentary Committee that examined the declaration of emergency during the Freedom Convoy and some of the very good and not so good recommendations that the committee has made to deal with future emergencies. Some of these are actually pretty funny. So the first thing you need to know about this committee is that it was chaired by independent, i.e. liberal appointed Senator Gwen Boniface, Bloc Québécois MP Réal Fortin, and the member from Hamilton, Matthew Green, who is one of the furthest left NDP MPs and spends a lot of his time these days protesting against Israel. So you can imagine what the majority report looks like. It has a pretty left and pro-government bias. But there's also a minority report here written by the Conservatives that has some pretty good ideas in it. So the Liberal majority report makes 21 recommendations, and I'm not going to go through them all. Suffice it to say that they used most of their resources to try to justify their unlawful invocation of the Emergencies Act after the fact, and also want to make it easier to do that sort of thing again. So I'll start with recommendation 13. They recommend that the federal government review the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act to determine if FINTRAC should be given additional powers when there are threats to the security of Canada, as defined in the CSIS Act. Then they go on to recommendation 17, that the federal government, in collaboration with the Canadian Bankers Association, the Canadian Credit Union Association, and FINTRAC, develop standardized processes regarding freezing and unfreezing accounts in the case that the Emergencies Act is invoked. And they say, recommendation 18, that the federal government review the financial measures of the Emergencies Act and amendments to the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Regulations in April 2022 to determine their efficacy and if legislation to address any gaps in regard to regulations for crowdfunding platforms should be enacted. So yes, you read that right. They want to do what Chrystia Freeland had promised during the height of the protests and make it even easier to freeze bank accounts and prevent raising money on crowdfunding. And obviously this is a big concern for any political group, for anyone who cares about civil liberties, for any minority groups. So that's not great. Then we get recommendation 14, that the federal government review the CSIS Act to ensure that the definition of threats to the security of Canada and CSIS's operational mandate are adequate and consistent with the Emergencies Act. And 15, that the federal government remove the incorporation by reference into the Emergencies Act of the definition of threats to the security of Canada from CSIS. And it's pretty clear what's going on here. So Justice Mosley found in his decision just about 1 year ago that invocation of the Emergencies Act was unlawful because there can only be a public order emergency where there are threats to the security of Canada, according to the Emergencies Act. And the Emergencies Act itself says in plain English that those words mean the same thing as they mean under the CSIS Act. And the justification that the government chose from the CSIS Act was essentially terrorism. Turns out there was never any evidence of a terrorist threat, so they had no basis for their decision. And now they just want to lower the bar. You'll probably recall that there were some fairly legitimate concerns about, trade being blocked at the Canada-US border, some blockades that were causing harm that were cleared up using normal police powers before invocation. And obviously, economic harm like this is not part of the definition of the act, but they just sort of pretended that it was. And now they say in recommendation 16 that the federal government should assess the role of economic factors in determining the existence of a national emergency and amend the Emergencies Act accordingly. In other words, they want to make it easier to call an emergency by claiming that there is some economic harm going on. Okay, so on to the NDP, which valiantly fought for civil liberties in the FLQ crisis in 1970, seems to have abandoned that mantle here. They agree with the Liberals on basically everything, but make a couple extra recommendations, which are basically related to investigating whether their police are involved in some sort of extremism, and also whether police should be defunded. So they're still in 2020, apparently. They do make one good recommendation, and that's they say that the act should be amended to reflect the obligation on the federal government to provide the Parliamentary Review Committee all the inputs to cabinet and to the ministers on the issue, including all information, advice, and recommendations provided to cabinet. So, the legal opinion that we never got to see about why, magically the words from the CSIS Act don't mean what they seem to obviously mean. Okay, so onto the Conservatives' minority report. It has some pretty useful recommendations. So the Conservatives reiterate that they fundamentally disagree that the Liberal government was justified and within its rights to invoke the Emergencies Act, as well as the recommendations which, in our view, would roll back accountability and future emergency about any future emergency. So that's what they say. And they recommend that the Emergencies Act be amended to require that the federal government, before issuing or continuing or amending a declaration, take into account recommendations of the provinces. That seems to be a good thing, because here we had provinces like Alberta and Quebec saying, we don't need this act, butt out, and that might have, stopped them in this case. They also recommend that the act be amended to require that the Prime Minister and ministers, before issuing, continuing, or amending a declaration, obtain written confirmations from the Commissioner of the RCMP and other police that they're unable to provide and execute operational plans to address the situation in a timely manner. And this is, of course, in response to the fact that Trudeau didn't even bother to ask the RCMP Commissioner whether she had, whether the legal tools that she had been exhausted or not. And as we know from the Rollo Commission, she didn't think they had. And also the PM, if he had just waited a couple of days, the plan that was in place and the regular laws that we already had would have taken care of the blockades and the other illegal activities that were associated with the protest. Okay, so the Conservatives are also opposed, unsurprisingly, to the recommendations to consider economic factors. They say, by seeking to amend the act after the fact to legitimize the arguments and legal theories on which the government declared a national emergency makes all the more obvious that there was little strength to them to begin with. Totally agree with that. And they say debanking can have drastic implications, and so they do not agree with developing standardized processes for freezing bank accounts. They also want to require a legal opinion be laid before each House of Parliament before parliamentarians vote on whether to confirm the declaration. And they want to change the threshold for the government to declare an emergency from believing on reasonable grounds to being satisfied on reasonable grounds that an emergency exists. And I think I like this threshold. It's obviously a higher threshold than the Act has now. And it suggests, you have to have some significant level of evidence for things like terrorist involvement rather than just some sort of bare belief. They also conclude that Public Safety Minister Marco Mendocino, quote, deliberately misled the committee. And they make this allegation in relation to the fact that he repeatedly claimed that the Emergencies Act was invoked on the advice of law enforcement, but he didn't really show up with the goods. And finally, they say that to ensure an additional focus of accountability in the Parliamentary Review Committee's work, Conservatives also recommend that the Emergencies Act be amended to specify that the chair or co-chair must be an opposition member of the House of Commons. And this would mean that the committee would hopefully spend less time trying to justify an unjustifiable decision after the fact than they did this time around. Okay, so tons of recommendations, lots of ideas, lots of shenanigans. Joanna, I know you're in favor of defunding police and investigating them for links to terrorism, but any other recommendations that stand out for you?
Yeah, I mean, I am focused on. I'm not surprised. I hadn't read the report yet, so thank you for the useful review. But I'm not surprised. But I'm still gobsmacked by the stuff about delinking the CSIS Act from the Emergencies Act. This also came up, by the way, in the Rouleau report when he made policy recommendations. He also recommended severing the link. And what I don't understand is these people seem to be saying, this is bogged down, this is too complex. No, like it's working exactly as it was designed to, which is, you have a sort of outside, impartial, less political body that is closer to law enforcement, that has intelligence about what possible dangerous activities are, or in the case of the Freedom Convoy, are not going on within Canada. And so just because they hit a road bump, like it makes me deeply cynical because the road bump came up and presumably everybody from the bottom to the top recognized that it was going to be a problem for the invocation of the Emergencies Act. But it's just like this cognitive dissonance. Instead of them concluding this must not be a public order emergency, they think, no, 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 the law must be written wrongly. So I find this deeply cynical. I'm shocked that they're doubling down even after the 3 years have passed. And the perspective we've gained in the intervening period, what we've seen about selective law enforcement with the post-October 7th protests. But in my opinion, the link worked exactly as it should. And it should be preserved. The rest of it is, I agree. I like the idea about consulting with the provinces. That was obviously a huge problem with the Freedom Convoy, and Alberta and Saskatchewan are continuing to protest that point. And I also like the NDP's proposal about enhanced transparency because, yes, we had this mysterious legal opinion that was shielded by solicitor-client privilege, but was the core to why we should believe in David Lametti and Marco Mendicino and Justin Trudeau when they say that they had a reasonable basis, reasonable grounds to believe that they had to act. Anything to add, Christine?
Yeah, I would just say that the link between the Emergencies Act and the CSIS Act, the incorporation of that definition, is not random, right? That definition was debated in Parliament when the CSIS Act was created, and it had just been sort of confirmed right before the Emergencies Act was written. So it was chosen for a reason, that it had already received that kind of scrutiny and endorsement. So the incorporation was extremely intentional to create that high threshold. It's not like a random inclusion because they were, oh, this seems convenient. It was extremely intentional because the threshold to use this extraordinary legislation is supposed to be very high. I would also add that we have our own list of recommendations for what reforms could be helpful for the Emergencies Act. We put them in to the Rouleau Commission back, whatever it was, November of 2022. Is that what it was now? I kind of forget. And there's also, you can read a sort of summary version in the National Post. We had Joanna, you and Sujit wrote an article that came out in November of 2022. So one of the recommendations that we had is that the head of the inquiry should be appointed by an impartial party instead of by, the government and the prime minister. It should be someone impartial, and that they be given more time to do their work. That they should be explicit that the inquiry has investigative powers. And another important recommendation is broadening access to cabinet confidences and expediting judicial review of national security and cabinet privilege. That was one of our other recommendations because that was quite a roadblock for all of this. There were, we had about 10 recommendations. If you want to read all of them, I won't go through them now. Just Google National Post 10 ways to fix the Emergencies Act, and I guarantee you will like these suggestions more than the government's suggestions. Let me turn now to my news headline, which is about Trudeau's decision to prorogue Parliament until March 24th. Joanna and I are both going to be talking about different aspects about this. So I have a lot to say about this. I'll try to get through it quickly, but there's a lot to understand. I'm going to try to explain what's going on and what people are saying about it, both politically and legally. So first, I think it's important to understand what prorogation is. I think our listeners kind of span the spectrum of like what does this word even mean to being experts in parliamentary procedure. So let me explain. Prorogation is a crown prerogative. It's taken on advice of the Prime Minister, and it terminates a session of Parliament. So Parliament can last for 4 years, and prorogation is basically a tool used to divide up that time. It ends one session of Parliament. It generally kills the bills of that session, although I believe there is a mechanism to bring them back in their current status using something called a programming motion, although that requires opposition consent. So when Parliament is recalled after prorogation, there is a speech from the throne, and we generally start fresh. And when Parliament is prorogued, bills cannot pass, but the government can continue to function just without new funding, which requires parliamentary approval. So it's sort of a break, and they can last for various lengths of time. I'll talk about that a little bit as well. This isn't new, even though the word might be, you only hear it every once in a while. We're quite familiar with prorogation. Trudeau prorogued Parliament, I think last in 2020, and that was for about a month after the WE scandal. So it's also not new to try to hit a refresh on your parliamentary session and on your government when you're faced with some political turmoil. There have been a number of pretty famous constitutional crises involving prorogation and the Governor General, and one was during the Harper era, and you may remember that. I was in law school at the time, so it was quite the discussion during my constitutional law classes. So the situation and all of this history, I'm gonna have to talk about the history because it's really important to understand, because it will be relied on in potential legal challenges to this prorogation. So I'm going to explain the other previous instances where there were these prorogation crises. So one was in 2008, 2009. It happened over the December-January period. So it involved Harper, who had a minority government, and it had just been elected. The Liberals and the NDP reached an agreement shortly after Harper's minority election to form a coalition with the Bloc Québécois agreeing to provide support on confidence votes. So this was a theoretical arrangement that would have enabled a working majority coalition that could have potentially replaced Harper's working minority. And their decision to, the Liberal NDP and sort of Bloc decision to form this sort of coalition was in response to Harper's new fiscal update that they didn't like for a variety of reasons. It was 6 weeks after the federal election, so there was a sense also that they were dissatisfied with the result, obviously. So Harper objected to this sort of coalition. He called it undemocratic, a backroom deal, and an attempt to overturn the election and replace it with a coalition that no one voted for. Now, there have been coalitions in the past, so that's sort of political characterization, but I think politically that was fairly effective. So in the face of this coalition, this sort of coalition, Harper asked for a prorogation from the Governor General. And the request, when the Prime Minister makes a request, it is called giving advice to the Crown to prorogue. And prorogation would have avoided Harper's government being either defeated in a confidence vote or even potentially replaced by the coalition. Various experts at the time were debating the different paths that were open to the Governor General. There was the path of dissolving Parliament and calling an election, although it was just 6 weeks after an election had already taken place. There was the option to prorogue Parliament, which is what Harper wanted. And there was the option to dismiss the Prime Minister and invite the opposition parties to form government. Now, that seems, maybe that sounds like to you like it might be out there, but it has happened in the past. There have been instances where the Governor General has declined the Prime Minister's advice to the Crown. And the most famous of that is the King Byng crisis in 1926. So it was called the King Byng crisis because the Prime Minister at the time was William Lyon Mackenzie King, and the Governor General was Lord Byng. This is important. I'll try to explain it quickly. Basically, what happened was the prime minister in 1926, King, had a minority. And when he formed his minority, he and the governor general had agreed that before a new election would take place, the Conservatives would be given a chance to govern because they actually had more seats. They had a plurality, and King was governing with a sort of coalition supported by some opposition. But King was, faced with losing a vote in 1926, and instead of facing that vote and being defeated on a confidence motion, he broke the agreement. He asked the Governor General to call an election instead of keeping the agreement to let the Tories govern and form a government. But Byng declined this advice to the Crown. He declined the Prime Minister's request for a prorogation and instead invited the Conservatives, led by Meehan, to form the government. And King, that's what happened. Meehan became the Prime Minister, King resigned, and the Meehan government was formed, although they quickly lost a confidence vote. An election was then called, and King won that election. And this story is really important because you'll hear a lot of people analogizing it to the current situation. That situation really did redefine the role of the Governor General, because after winning, Prime Minister King sought an imperial conference to redefine the role of the Governor General. It would no longer be a representative of the British government. It would only be a representative of the monarch. And that was the last time that a Governor General in Canada refused the advice of the Prime Minister. So back to what happened in 2008, where that instance was also being analogized to the King-Byng affair. In 2008, instead of doing what Byng did and allowing the coalition to form a government, the Governor General accepted Harper's advice and prorogued Parliament from December 2nd to January with a confidence vote the following day. It was like at the end of January. With the day they came back was their next day, there was a confidence vote on a budget. So we've been asked a few times now. So that's sort of the history of cases where this has been a really big issue. And we've been asked a few times about whether or not prorogation can be challenged in the courts legally and whether it should be. And there have been a few people speaking about this. Duff Conacher from the group called Democracy Watch has already said he would consider a challenge. The Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms has said that they are going to do a challenge. I think there's another group that also said they're going to be doing a challenge. I forget the name of that group. And, there has been, a lot of commentary about these challenges are happening, and there's been commentary about what paths were open to the Governor General. So Emmett McFarland of Waterloo wrote that the Governor General could have been convinced to allow for a prorogation, but only if it was relatively short to allow for a Liberal leadership, followed by a confidence vote. I actually don't think I agree. It's not the length of the delay that causes issues. Charlie Feldman on Twitter, he's the president of a group called the Canadian Study of Parliament. He has a whole thread on prorogations, and he said the longest prorogation was actually a year, and the shortest was just a few hours, and that long prorogations actually used to be the standard. Now, another expert on this topic, Howard Anglin, wrote for The Hub that the Governor General should not have granted the prorogation request, and that while Trudeau won a confidence vote less than a month ago, Jagmeet Singh has now said he would bring down the government no matter who the leader is. So the Liberal leadership doesn't really matter. And Anglin said that this creates good reason to believe there is no confidence in the government, which creates a constitutional problem. Anglin said that in some cases it may be useful to prorogue to take the time to resolve a case of constitutional uncertainty, which is what he said happened in 2008. But it is not appropriate to prorogue when doing so would simply prolong the uncertainty. I don't think I agree, although I reserve my right to change my mind. I think that, Anglin says we should not take Singh's word at face value because, Singh is kind of notorious for changing his mind about whether or not he's going to support the government, saying, oh, this government stinks, they're no good, but then going on to vote to support them. So Singh said we shouldn't take their word at face value, but then he kind of goes on to do that. I don't see any reason to believe Singh this time. I don't think that it's even close to enough for this government Governor General to interfere and decline the advice, doing something that hasn't happened since 1926. Basically, by convention, it's up to the Governor General to decide. I don't know if it's appropriate for the courts to intervene in cases like this. These are at their very core, in my sort of gut reaction is that these are parliamentary and political disputes. Now, to be clear, I'm not reading Anglin's position as suggesting there should be a legal challenge. He's just saying that the Governor General could refuse or should refuse. But there have been other people saying that there is precedent for bringing a legal challenge. And a lot of them are relying on a sort of strange case from the United Kingdom called R. Miller and the Prime Minister. And in that case, Prime Minister Boris Johnson had sought a prorogation because he was dealing with what was at the time called a hard Brexit. Brexit was approaching and there wasn't a deal. So he shut down Parliament. And this was challenged, the prorogation was challenged, and the UK Supreme Court found that Johnson's advice to the Crown to prorogue was unlawful, and that the existence and the scope of the prerogative power to prorogue is justiciable. It can be decided by the courts. They found that the prorogation interfered with the principle of parliamentary sovereignty by preventing Parliament from legislating around Brexit, and it shielded the government from oversight of parliamentary committees. But I don't think that this UK case is a useful case for anyone. As a friend and listener of the podcast pointed out to me, the opening paragraph of the UK decision says that the case arises in circumstances which have never arisen before and are unlikely to ever arise again. It is a one-off. So I don't know that we should be, looking so positively on what is described by the UK court, a foreign jurisdiction, as a one-off case. There is also some skepticism about the reasoning of that UK case. Administrative law expert Paul Daly has written about it both in his blog and in the Canadian Journal of Comparative and Contemporary Law. If you're interested in the article, it's called A Critical Analysis of the Case of Prorogations. And, I've already gone on pretty long, so I won't dive into it too deeply. But basically, he raises a number of concerns about the UK decision, including concerns about justiciability, doctrinal coherence, and remedy, saying that the case turns doctrine and history on its head. So in my opinion, although again, I say I reserve my right to change my mind, this prorogation is more similar to the 2008-2009 prorogation than any of these other examples, like the King Byng affair or the Boris Johnson Brexit prorogation. The main difference is that it is longer than in 2008, but the length of the delay, as I said, isn't, the core of the issue. This is sort of my gut reaction based on looking at different cases and scenarios. And of course, I'm saying all of this from a legal perspective. This is not a political endorsement. I do not agree politically with Trudeau's decision to prorogue. I think politically it's disgusting, it's selfish, it's self-serving, it's unpatriotic. We are at the verge of a trade war with the United States. Canada's calling us the 51st state, saying he wants to acquire Canada using economic force. The priority should not be a Liberal leadership race and a lame duck prime minister sent in into negotiations. We should be functioning as a, normal government, not navel gazing, indulging the Liberals in navel gazing the way they are. Josh, that was a lot. What do you think?
That was a lot, but I loved it. Like, I'm here all day for this type of stuff. It's just so interesting. So yeah, I think I agree with most of what you've said here, and I think there are a couple things I want to add. So one is that, the convention here is that the Governor General is going to take the advice of the Prime Minister, in my view, unless there's been a confidence vote that's been lost. And in both the case of Harper in 2008, like, there had just been an election. That's the greatest confidence vote of all. And there had not yet been any confidence vote that he lost in the House. And with Trudeau here, people seem to forget that he did just win several confidence votes in a row. So, like, realistically, does he have the confidence of the House? I very much doubt it. But if the Governor General is basing that on the actual votes in the House, then I think she's well within her rights to, like, make the decision that she made. It's one thing to say, I'm the leader of the NDP and I'm going to tell my MPs to vote non-confidence at the earliest opportunity. It's another thing for that vote to have actually taken place. And you already have at least one MP publicly and rumblings about other MPs privately who are NDP who are saying they're not going to vote no confidence when the House comes back. So we really don't know at this point. And whether you agree with the decision or not, I feel like it's within the Governor General's rights to do what she did. The other interesting thing is just thinking back to British Columbia. I think it was 2007 or 8 where Christy Clark had just been reelected as she was still premier, but she actually had fewer votes than the NDP and Greens in British Columbia combined by about two seats. So there was a real question about who had confidence, and the Governor General there let her try to govern. She couldn't get votes passed, and John Horgan became premier. And then it turned out he had a very successful parliament in terms of being able to get votes passed. So it's just another example of where this stuff seems to work pretty well. Another couple minor things I want to point out. Well, maybe not minor, but if people are considering some sort of legal challenge against this, you have to remember that the charter talks about limits on how long parliaments can go on, and that would be obviously really, really important here. So you have Section 4 of the charter says no House of Commons or Legislative Assembly shall continue for longer than 5 years from the date fixed from the return of the writs at a general election of its members. So if some prime minister was trying to go beyond 5 years, and by the way, 4.2 says that there's an exception for apprehended war, invasion, or insurrection. So barring that, if it tried to go beyond 5 years, then the Governor General would obviously be within her rights to say, no, you can't continue. And then there's Section 5, which says there shall be a sitting of Parliament and each legislature at least once every 12 months. So again, you can't prorogue for more than 12 months, but otherwise the charter is, pretty clear that this is going to be allowed. So one last thing I'll say is I think you mentioned that parliaments normally last 4 years, and just so we don't get people tweeting at us that we're wrong, that's the Canada Elections Act, right? So traditionally in Canada, in the past couple decades, parliaments have lasted maximum 4 years because that's when the fixed election date is. But under the Constitution, it is 5 years. So if we got rid of the Canada Election Act, we'd be back at the 5 year point. So just wanted to add that so people don't get confused.
Don't yell at me, please.
I was fighting with someone on Twitter about this recently because they said Justin Trudeau deserves to serve out his full 4 year term. And I was trying to explain there's no terms in Parliament. It's as long as there's confidence from Parliament that he gets to continue his government. But anyway, Joanna, I know you have tons of thoughts on this. Do you want to give some reaction before you tell us about the consequences?
Well, that was really substantive, and thank you. I don't think that I have thought about the King Bing affair since I was in probably high school. And I remember it being very convoluted then, a little less convoluted now. The whole thing about prime ministerial terms is such a popular misconception. I was listening to today, the New York Times Daily is all about the fall of Justin Trudeau, and they say he announced he would not serve out his term. I'm like, And also their new Canada reporter can't pronounce Pierre Poilievre, which is just classic New York Times. One interesting thought is, would Section 4.2 apprehended wars or insurrections? Do you think that would encompass the current Trump saber rattling, or it's like the opposite of saber rattling?
Don't give him any ideas, Joanna. Please. We're going to cut this. This is out.
No, yeah, fair. No,
Maybe.
likely not, but I don't think he's just trolling at this point. In any event, yeah, look, I'm very sympathetic to Howard Anglin, and not just because he's my former boss, and I think the world of him, and I think he's super smart. I think that's a totally reasonable position to say, look, this would be distinguishable from example from the Harper prorogation. And Simon would be could reasonably refuse the grant for prorogation, but that is an ocean away from this claim in these attempted judicial reviews that we want unelected judges stepping in and determining the appropriateness and reviewing the case of prorogation. And so, unfortunately, we've had a lot of inquiries about our position on this, and it is a tension, for some sort of inside baseball. It's a tension within our organization that we support, traditional parliamentary, traditional Westminster procedure. We think that parliamentary constitutional monarchies are, well, at least Josh and I think constitutional monarchies are an excellent system of governance. Christine is a bit more of a skeptic, and we believe that Parliament is sovereign, Parliament is supreme. We also are skeptical of giving judges who are cloistered and in thought bubbles increased scope over every aspect of our public life, and particularly political decisions. But of course, we also believe in strong judicial review where warranted. And I'm not going to get into where we draw the line, but this is a clear instance where the JCCF and people saying, this is a living tree and judges should step in and tell us if it was appropriate. Like, first of all, practically, also a friend of the pod brought this up yesterday. This has been obviously main topic of conversation. Practically speaking, this is for sure going to be moot by the time it's heard, the judicial reviews. I don't think there's any possibility that they'll get a hearing before March 24th. And judges are not going to want to touch this. So I get that that certain groups are going to fundraise and farm off of this is, I suppose, hopefully the last dregs of people, people being so possessed by hate of Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government that they, let's be honest, are just motivated by wanting to stick it to him. I saw even the CEO of Shopify, Tobias Lutke, was egging this on. But that doesn't mean that it's legally correct or appropriate. So sorry. Yes, horrible decision. We hate it. We hate that we have a so-called caretaker government when Trump is going to take office. It's self-serving. It serves only the interest of the Liberal Party. It's cowardly. But that doesn't mean that asking judges to fix it, in this case, the cure might be worse than the disease. Okay. So let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, I'm going to talk about some of the zany bills that hopefully will be dead forever with this prorogation. Okay. So as Christine briefly mentioned in her segment, when Parliament is prorogued, all government bills and other government business in progress effectively die on the order paper. Although also, as she mentioned, and I was trying to dig around, we heard MP Michelle Rempel-Garner refer to the fact that Parliament or a member of Parliament can bring what I think she referred to as a programming motion that would bring back all existing bills once Parliament resumes session. The only thing I could turn up is a program motion. So I think it might be called a program motion, not a programming motion. I don't know if it requires opposition consent, but presumably at very least it would require NDP consent. So I'll comment on that a little bit later. But let's get into what current bills are currently dead and hopefully will not be brought back from the grave on March 24th. So first, we have the capital gains inclusion rate. So in April 2024, the Trudeau government announced that they were proposing to raise the capital gains inclusion rate to a pretty stunning 66%. This is the first time the capital gains tax has been increased in 25 years. And the proposal never made it past the sort of initial, what's called the Ways and Means motion stage, meaning that the corresponding and requisite legislation was never introduced or debated. Now, it turns out this was news to us because we are not tax lawyers, but we looked into it. And it turns out that it's actually common practice in Canadian tax law for new proposals to take effect and be collected upon immediately, even before they're confirmed in the House of Commons. And the Canada Revenue Agency has said that it would continue to apply the proposed increases even if an election is called. However, in this case, many commentators have remarked, and I agree, that this is a fairly exceptional case because the Conservative Party has stated repeatedly and vocally that they are opposed to the capital gains tax hike. And if they are elected, they would not follow through with it. So given the uncertainty and given what we know about public support for the Conservative Party and their current lead in the polls, it's highly likely that this proposal will never be passed. And so a more prudent approach would be for the CRA to just take a pause on enforcing this new inclusion rate until there is a government, whether it's Conservative government or a Liberal NDP or whatever the government is, but a government that can confirm their intentions rather than having to deal with the fallout of going back and issuing refunds. That would seem highly prudent to me, but it doesn't seem to be the chosen path that the CRA is committing to, not really surprisingly. Now let's turn to some ill-advised Senate bills that I only learned of in the last few days because they haven't gotten much attention, with the exception of a MAID bill. And Senate bills do die also on the order paper with prorogation. So let me tell you a bit about what our senators have been up to up in their chamber, up into their sober second thought chamber. So there is Bill S-210, which is aimed at restricting young people's access to online sexually explicit materials, which of course sounds unobjectionable, but the bill is proposing mandatory age verification methods, which would entail collection of biometrics or passports or other personal data that to be held by platforms, presumably. And moreover, it would transfer responsibility from parents to the state, which we've talked about several times as something we are philosophically opposed to. But in the bill's own drafting, it acknowledges that it would lead to blocking of legitimate content. So it says it could encompass orders that would block content that is not sexually explicit or block content from persons who are not minors. It actually says that in the bill if the federal court deems it necessary. So it's just acknowledging that it's going to have a huge catchment that will presumably result in blocking of protected content. So not great drafting and not a great idea. But it gets worse. Then you have Senator Belmal has proposed Bill S-275, which is aiming at reforming the Bank of Canada's governance structure and mandate. It proposes a 9-member permanent committee on monetary policy with 6 external members, and it sets dual objectives for monetary policy. So in general, monetary policy is aimed at price stability, but it would add full employment. It would also expand the bank's mandate to include financial stability and quote unquote sustainable and equitable prosperity. So that's a huge red flag. Sustainable and equitable prosperity is super vague, super broad, and presumably could justify pretty much any proposed intervention into the economy. It's a huge mission creep to expand a central bank beyond monetary stability. And then this whole proposed mandate about full employment suggests that the Bank of Canada would start actively manipulating the economy to achieve employment goals rather than letting there be a sort of Pareto efficiency. I think that there are market advantages to not having full employment in, certain economic conditions. Again, not our expertise, but sounds like a very bad idea, not to mention all of these new proposed committees and reporting requirements and oversight committees, just more bureaucratic bloat. Very bad idea. Then we have two from Senator Kim Pate. So first, Senator Pate has proposed Bill S-233, which would require the Minister of Finance to develop a national framework for implementing universal basic income, or UBI, for all Canadians. And to me, the most compelling rationale for UBI is that it's a more voluntary and decentralized way of ensuring that citizens have their basic needs met. So you get UBI, and then we cut off basically all other social entitlements. Everybody has enough money to pay for food and housing, and the rest, you sort of fend for yourself. I think that's like the original rationale for UBI. But in Pate's version of UBI, she specifies that the implementation of a guaranteed livable basic income does not result in a decrease of services or benefits. So just doubling taxation and entitlements, not to mention the possible issues here for the division of powers and provincial jurisdiction. And then it gets even worse. Senator Pate also has Bill S-230, proposing reforms for incarcerated individuals, mandating mental health assessments, mandating transfers to hospitals or psychiatric facilities if deemed necessary, also mandating that any inmate's request to transfer to a healing lodge be approved unless a court decides they would not be in the interests of justice, which would result in many more transfers to healing lodges, which have noted problems with escape and security. And Senator Pate's fellow Senator Claude Carignan remarked that this bill will cause many serious problems and is unworkable in practice. And finally, you have Senator Pamela Wallin's proposed expansion of medically assisted death in Bill S-248. She proposes two main changes to the MAID law. First, it would allow individuals who do not have a reasonably foreseeable death to make advance arrangements for MAID on a specified future date, even if they lose decision-making capacity. And second, it would allow individuals diagnosed with a serious and uncurable condition to waive the requirement for final consent through a written declaration, which would remain valid for 5 years. So obviously removing safeguards. 5 years is quite a long time, particularly in the current climate of medical innovation. So this is just ripe for abuse of vulnerable or disabled individuals who may change their mind and not be able to communicate this. And then finally, we've talked about this so much, but there is, of course, the crown jewel in the Liberals' legislative agenda over the last few years, the Online Harms Act. Now, as you know, if you're a regular listener, by the end of last year, much of this bill already looked like it was dead, specifically parts 2 and 3, which are focused on increasing criminal penalties for hate speech and creating new crime in the offense motivated by hatred. But the Liberals were still posturing to push ahead with part 1 of the bill, which is just as bad, even more insidious. It obliges social media platforms to implement measures to mitigate the risk that users will be exposed to harmful content, including content that foments hatred, which is a vague standard, which is sure to lead to blocking of protected content. And in light of yesterday's announcement by Mark Zuckerberg that Meta would no longer use independent fact checkers to police content on its platforms, this proposal seems wildly out of step with the current zeitgeist, and hopefully it will not be brought back. But then, just to reiterate, for all of that, none of these bills are certain to be dead. There is a procedural possibility to bring back a program motion which would restore these bills. I think at very least this would require the support of the NDP. Jagmeet Singh has said that he would not supply confidence to the government on a confidence motion, but I don't think that's the same as saying that he would not support these proposals, many of which are very much in the vein of the NDP's vibe. But they have certainly hit a speed bump. So, Josh, which is your favorite senator and which is your favorite bill? Are you into the healing lodges? Are you into the vastly expanded powers of central banking, which I know you're a huge fan of? Which of these stand out to you?
Yeah, anything Kim Pate puts forward, I'm always in favor of. I think all criminals should go to healing lodges, and that'll be safe for everyone, and people will be healed, and we'll have no more crime. I don't have all that much to say about this other than like maybe we don't even need a government after all. If this is what they're up to, maybe it's time to just go full anarchy because, none of this seems like a useful a good use of the vast resources that we spend on the Senate every year. So maybe prorogation is a good thing, and we should just let it continue forever. I don't know, Christine, what do you think?
So, did you talk about the likelihood of these actually passing, Joanna? Like some of those bills are pretty out there. Like, were they ever gonna actually
Well,
be something?
the Healing Lodge bill already passed third reading and was going up to the House.
Wow. Okay.
So
Uh,
don't be shocked. Don't
yeah.
underestimate,
The one that bothers me the most is actually the CRA stuff because that has really, really wide implications for so many Canadians. And like it's bizarre to me that it's going to be treated like it has passed when it has not. I want to know because I actually don't know how this works. If a new government, so this is supposed to take effect on or after June 25th. Um, and the filing date, sorry, June of last year, and the
Last
filing
year.
date, yeah, that's what I just corrected myself. Sorry, and the filing date is going to be March 3rd this year, but it never passed, um, and it won't pass. It won't pass because we're going to be prorogued until then. So if this gets reversed, if there's an election and a new government that reverses what never came to be, like, do people get refunds? I don't know. I
Yeah.
want to know that do they get refunds? Is
yeah, I
that
would
how it
Yeah,
think
works?
so.
there's a policy document that's given to auditors, and basically the policy is like they're gonna tell everyone you must remit this tax, and then if once it becomes clear that it's not happening, they're going to refund the money. But they're also not going to audit people and say you should have paid this tax, but you didn't. So the auditors are told to stand down until the legislation is passed. So it's like the CRA is going to you publicly and saying like you must give us the money, but then they're not actually going to enforce it until it's passed, and they're going to do refunds, which would be like billions of dollars in this
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
Like
I hope that they're like accounting for that how much work they're going to put themselves through. It's also obviously so distorting, right? It's so distorting on the economy because Canadians who might otherwise have realized a capital gains will be like, I don't want to deal with this, so I'm not
Right.
going to realize my capital gain this year, which has huge widespread implications for our
Yeah.
economy and for individuals like how they live their lives, right? I mean, sometimes you can't put it off, but if you can, you're going to because it's not just like a mess of having to deal with the additional cost. It's also like a huge mess of paperwork that people just don't want to deal with. So to me, that one is actually the most, like, that one bothers me the most because it's actually like happening.
and
um
it's small business owners too,
yeah.
right? Like people think, oh, capital gains are like rich people selling their cottage. I mean, sometimes they are, but often it's people that have like worked their whole life, put all their money into a business, like a dry cleaner, and then they sell it in 1 year, realize like $1 million, payout, but that's their entire retirement. And
Yeah,
then they have to pay include 66% of that revenue
it's
instead of
crazy.
50. It's like they need to know, like people need to know if they could retire, right? So
Yeah.
anyway, sorry.
Yeah, CRA should get our bad legal take this week. But Josh, why don't you give yours?
Yeah, that's a good bonus bad legal take. Okay. Mine goes to a bunch of homeless people and legal activists in Hamilton. And, I don't want to sound like a mean person here, but I think that their legal argument is very bad. So they say that the city of Hamilton was violating their charter rights by evicting them from encampments they had built in public parks during the day. So, as listeners probably know, there's some questionable case law out there that says it's a violation of the charter right to security of the person to prevent somebody from sheltering themselves in a park at night from the elements when there's insufficient space in homeless shelters. And there's a big debate about whether that's correct or not, and I don't really have a side to pick on that. But the issue here in this case was whether also dismantling the growing camps that exist in every park during the day and saying you can sleep in the park at night, but you can't just build an encampment and occupy the park, whether that is also a violation of the same rights. And you kind of know where the judge is going with this by paragraph 4 of the decision, where he writes, or he or she, I'm not sure actually. Justice Ramsey writes, I was reminded by counsel for the applicants that while the legislature represents the will of the people, the court holds the moral compass that is often the only protection for the most vulnerable. I observe that the most vulnerable includes not only the homeless, but also elderly persons and children who want to use a sidewalk or a city park without tiptoeing through used needles and human feces. Okay, I'm obviously not a heartless person. I don't think the judge is either, and I can sympathize with anybody who becomes homeless for reasons beyond their control, but the facts here are pretty illuminating. So basically, all but one of the applicants is a drug user, and the other one has a dog, and they had all been given housing at some point. Some of them had rent subsidized apartments, some of them had hotel rooms that they had moved out of, others had tax access to taxpayer funded shelters, but they didn't want to be in the shelters because in some cases their big scary pit bulls were not allowed, or they wanted to continue doing hard drugs and the shelters didn't allow them, or in one case someone said there were too many drugs in the shelter and so she didn't want to be there and she wanted to build an encampment instead. And the decision notes that the city spent, this is Hamilton, Ontario, $61.5 million in 2022 on the homeless. And there are various statistics on how many homeless people there are, but one prominent one says there are about 500. So that's like 6 figures per homeless people just spent by the city alone. What are we doing here, people? I don't know. Anyway, so Justice Ramsey says, I found that the city did not prevent anybody from staying overnight. I'm asked to extend the right to stay in encampments to public parks in the daytime. That is to not have to tear down and move every day. The extension is said to be conditional on the lack of accessible shelter space that was stipulated as a condition in the Waterloo case, so one of these other recent encampment cases. I find it impossible to extend this conditional right. First of all, I don't see a connection between the right and the conditions, and then he lists these conditions that they say create the right, like, the shelter won't allow my dog, or the shelter won't permit hard drug use. And then he says, the life, liberty, and security of the person, of the applicants, are not put at risk by the encampments, by the enforcement. They are put at risk by homelessness. Encampments contribute to that risk. They're lawless, dangerous, and unsanitary. And he says, in all of this, we must not lose sight of the countervailing interest of preserving public parks. It was an important enough public interest in the Toronto encampment and Junction case, so this is U of T. And finally, extending the freedom from enforcement to daytime or indefinite encampment would amount to expropriating property, or at least severely limiting property rights. City officials have noticed that since the implementation of the new protocol, some occupants have become more territorial or possessive of their camps. Extension of freedom from enforcement would have the effect of depriving the city of the use and enjoyment of its property. And for these reasons, I do not extend the prohibition on enforcement to daytime or to indefinite camping. Okay, so I think that's a good decision. And so obviously my legal take is those people who argued that the homeless can just expropriate parks permanently and build 24/7 encampments because they don't like the shelter that they've been provided by taxpayers at great expense. And I have to say, I look forward to seeing what happens in Ontario, where there's a proposal that people found using drugs in public places, like hard drugs, will be given the option of jail or treatment, because I think that might actually finally solve this problem. Joanna, let's hear your bad legal take.
So my bad legal take of the week goes to Manon Janot, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Quebec, so the Crown's representative in Quebec, who stated that she is not going to reject a law or bill unless it goes against human rights. So this is, of course, a non-elected official unilaterally appointed by Ottawa. And as we've talked about the roles of lieutenant governors and governor generals, they have a largely procedural, ceremonial role. Their job is not to assess laws for if they fit whatever vague, broad definition of human rights she has in mind. And it's certainly not her role to do any type of substantive review of laws. So bad legal take and a very odd thing to say publicly, which reflects that there are serious problems with how she understands her role. What about
I
you?
don't know. Yeah, now people just want the governor general to do all kinds of things. I guess
Yeah.
that's the new 2025 vibe is like all the power to the crown, I guess. I'm not here for it. So my bad legal take goes to CTV and various trolls on Twitter. And I guess maybe to myself, like maybe I shouldn't be engaging with Twitter trolls, but sometimes I do.
It's
I don't
hard.
know why. Yeah, it's hard. So on Monday, as we all know, the Prime Minister announced his resignation, and I was watching the coverage on CTV, and they ran a little package on his legacy, you know, as they do. And one of the things they covered as part of his legacy was his invocation of the Emergencies Act, which I agree is part of how he will be remembered. It's an important part of how he will be remembered. But they followed that with a description of how the Rouleau Commission found that the threshold to invoke the act was met. And they did not mention that the federal court reached an entirely different conclusion from our case. And the federal court found that his use of the act was the act was invoked illegally, and that the regulations under it were unconstitutional, and that this is actually more important than the Rouleau inquiry because it is binding precedent, and they didn't mention it at all, and it's incredibly frustrating and misleading to omit this. So I said on a post on X that this was misleading, or it was an omission, this important and frustrating omission. I described the case, the federal court case, and I included a CTV clip. And this is what further frustrated me, because a bunch of like old boomers on Twitter decided to explain our own case back to me. And these dudes were saying, you need to read the decision. That's not what it said. Like, it was our case. I cannot count how many times I have read this decision. I obviously know what it said. I don't need some non-lawyer old man trying to incorrectly explain our own case to me and getting it completely wrong. Another one of my favorite responses to this was with respect to the Emergencies Act. Someone said it was the best thing that happened during the Freedomers occupation. I don't care if it was legal or not. And that sort of tells you everything you need to know about the Trudeau cult. Like, I am so right. I don't care if it was legal or not. Like, wow, so many bad legal takes. I probably shouldn't have engaged so much, but I try to use people who are wrong on Twitter. I try to use it as an opportunity to like educate and explain our work. But this time it was to my own detriment of my own sanity because of how enraged these exchanges made me. So that's it for me.
All right. Great first show of the new year. That was a lot of fun. And for those who haven't already, please rate us, review us, and subscribe. And as a reminder, you can support our work by subscribing to the CCF's YouTube channel, by following us on X, or by visiting our website, theccf.ca, where you can sign up for our Freedom Update newsletter from our colleague Russ. The CCF is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please click that donate button on our website if you can. Thank you for listening.